Hello and welcome to Film School Dropout, my new podcast. And what better way to start this podcast than kickstarting it with a Martin Scorsese series? If you're listening to me, you probably have a vague knowledge of who I am, but I'll give it anyway. My name is Ben Friedman. I am a film critic based in Sacramento. I write for such publications as Highbrow Magazine. I've been working in this industry for 2.5, 3 years. Maybe you've heard of me, maybe you haven't. It doesn't matter. If you're watching this, thank you for joining me. You don't know how much I appreciate it. And let me just kind of give you the vibe of this show and kind of the inception of it. I'm talking Martin Scorsese to kickstart this series because it is essentially, the idea is there's kind of this gatekeeping going on with film right now, where it's, can you be a true fan if you haven't seen this? Everyone's seen this amount of film. I kind of want to just give it back and just talk about film as I've always understood it, which is something to be enjoyed, something to be critiqued, something to be loved, and something to study. And that's what the purpose of this show is. My only goal for the audience here watching this show is that you have a better appreciation and love for movies and directors and what makes art special. If you come away with anything at the end of any of these episodes, it is what makes art such a special form of communication and society and culture. That's really what I want. I went to Chico State between the years of 2016 2020. I was a cultural historian, which does not make you a lot of money. However, it does give you insight into the way the world works and how we think. And art is such an important aspect of that. And that's why I really wanted to focus this, because I think to better understand this culture and society we live in, the best place to start is the arts. We have the written document, we have primary sources, and yet it is the art that we make, the anxiety that artists are feeling, the joy that they're feeling, what they're taking away, the studios, all of that, the history of film, the history of art is all just part of American history and the history of the world at a greater context. And again, that's really what I want to focus on. And I'm not going to pretend that I am the best film critic in the world. I approach this with humility. I approach this with an understanding that hopefully over the next coming months and years, I'll get better at this and I'll have a more defined structure of the show. Funny enough, while recording this series, I didn't have a structure for it. For half of this, I didn't even know what I was going to call this. I just knew that I wanted to talk about Martin Scorsese's filmography. And that's what we're going to be doing in this series. I'll be having a variety of guests. Some of them are film critics, some of them are actors, some of them are directors, but everyone who is coming on this show has one understanding and appreciation, and that is they all speak the same language, which is the language of movie and filmmaking. That's what I'm here to talk about. That's why I'm making this. And I hope, again, that you just get something enjoyable from this. That is really my goal. But with that all said, if you just get out of this an hour of enjoyment and fun conversation, so be it. I've won. So thank you for the past 2.5 years of support. My channel has grown. My writing has grown. I feel so much better as a critic than I did 2.5 years ago. And this is starting an exciting chapter in my life. With that all said, we are kickstarting this series of Film School Dropout, and we're focusing on Martin Scorsese. And where better to start than at the beginning with Who's That Knocking at My Door? A 1967 release starring Harvey Keitel. It premiered at the Chicago Film Festival and is pretty famous for one factor and one factor alone. Roger Ebert is at that same festival that year and identifies Martin Scorsese as a talented director. Their friendship is something that will be explored in this episode, along with occasionally throughout the series. And we're just going to dive into that. Joining me today for this first episode, I'm so glad that he agreed to come on and that he wanted to do this movie specifically, is Thomas Stoneham-Judge. He is a founder and editor-in-chief of a film site called ForReel. He is a Seattle-based film critic. Thomas was a joy to talk to, and I just cannot wait for you all to hear this episode and just dive into the first Scorsese series with me and dive into the series with me. So I hope you enjoy. Thank you all for watching, and we'll be right back.
So that's really a French magazine, huh?
Yes, I'm afraid it is.
Why? Now, how the hell did they ever get a hold of The Searchers?
The what?
The Searchers. It's a movie made about 11 years ago, and that picture of John Wayne is from that movie.
Today we are starting. This is the kickstart. This is the first day of Scorsese September, where I am talking about every Martin Scorsese film ever made, from his theatrical releases, from his documentaries to his short films. And today we're kicking off the series with Who's That Knocking at My Door? And joining me today is Thomas Stoneham-Judge, founder and editor-in-chief at ForReel. Thomas, how are you doing today?
I'm great. I appreciate you having me on. This is an honor to be talking about Scorsese's narrative feature debut, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
I'm really looking forward to having you on. Thomas, just because I don't know everything about you at this point, could you tell people what ForReel is and what exactly you do with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So ForReel is my my place for putting thoughts about movies. It's kind of a bunch of different things, really. We publish movie reviews, but we also do film festival coverage. I have a video series that I call Real Buzzed, where I talk about recently released movies and pair it with a whiskey. So there's kind of a bunch of things that we have on there. I think there's some a little bit of something for everyone, and yeah, I encourage you to go check that out after you listen to this episode. You can find my website at thisisforreel.com. For real, of course, spelled FORREEL.
Perfect. And there is something really exciting about when you agreed to want to do the first Scorsese movie, because this is kind of the inception of everything. Like, this is where it all begins. And to maybe not necessarily fully understand Scorsese, you have to understand his first movie, but it is certainly, I love when we look at a director and kind of see what's in their toolbox. And that's what this film is. So before we really jump into anything, Thomas, I just wanted to first kind of learn about you and where your love for movies came from.
Oh, that's a good question. My love for movies, I can very clearly trace back the start of my interest in film and storytelling in film to the Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. That series will always be my favorite movie series ever, just because well, firstly, Lord of the Rings is amazing. Those are phenomenal films. But also just at the time that they came out, it was just a really impressionable time for me. And I think that was just the pinnacle of storytelling, especially in the realm of like fantasy and action and blockbuster cinema making. Like that was just a really good time to hit me with something that epic. And so ever since then, I just got more and more interested in what storytelling looks like in other films, and kind of expanded my interests beyond mainstream into indie stuff, experimental stuff. And this is part of why I enjoy covering film festivals so much, because you find so much variety at film festivals, and that's a really great way to complement what the mainstream movies that everyone sees and talks about. Film festivals also give you a window into just incredible storytelling outside of the mainstream.
Were you one of these guys that when you realized that you liked talking about movies, that you knew right away that you wanted to basically write film criticism? Or were you someone who was like, I actually want to be a little bit more hands-on? Like, did you have aspirations for director, actor, anything like that?
I think I'm still earning those aspirations. One thing that I have realized, I guess I got into film criticism almost accidentally. I think I was just posting It was probably 6 or 7 years ago. I was just posting my thoughts on Facebook, and my thoughts went from like 2 sentence reactions to films to 2 paragraph reactions to films, and then 4 paragraph reactions. And there just came a point where I was like, I think this deserves its own space. And so just for fun, I started the website, and I'm a marketing person, so I branded it and just kind of made that a pet project. And I mean, in many ways, it is still very much a pet project, but it is also grown a lot. And something that I think about as a film critic is I do think that at some point I would like to make a movie, not just because storytelling is such a prominent component of who I am and how I interpret art, but also because I think that if I'm going to criticize film, I should probably learn more about what it takes to make a film. And I've learned a little bit about that in interviews that I've done with filmmakers, producers, actors. So over the years, it's been kind of nice to get that insight from people who are on the ground and making films, and working with budgets and getting financing and all the challenges that come with filmmaking. So I've been able to learn a little bit kind of secondhand from that. But at some point, I do think I would like to jump in the director's seat and just see what it's like to have to put all of that together. I know it's a challenge, but one of these days.
You mentioned an interesting point that it is actually kind of so critical for Who's That Knocking at My Door, which is this idea of a filmmaker slash a film critic. Because in the case of Who's That Knocking at My Door, those two actually are pretty intertwined in their own story. And we'll kind of get to that as it goes. But I don't want to jump too far down, but let's just kind of focus back. It's when you're talking about, publishing, writing, all this stuff, doing it for 7 to 8 years. What was the moment that it kind of started feeling more real for you?
It's fascinating. This is a really great question, because the moment that it really started feeling real for me was actually during the pandemic, when I think a lot of us figured out stuff to do with our time.
Yeah.
During the pandemic, it felt real to me when a good friend of mine, Taylor Baker over at Drinking the Movies, we're really good friends, and we were talking, and he said one day towards the beginning of the pandemic, hey, film festivals are going virtual. You should apply to Fantasia. That film festival is coming up and they're accepting applications. And I'm like, there's no way Fantasia is going to accept my application. It'll be fun. I'll throw it in there, but no expectations. But when Fantasia accepted my application, that was like a huge, huge moment for me. Oh my gosh, I guess I'm worthy. I should probably act like it, And from there, that was just a really huge confidence booster for me pursuing other film. I mean, if I got into Fantasia, obviously remotely at that time, if I covered Fantasia, what else can I do? I got accepted to AFI. I did that remotely. South by Southwest the next year, did that remotely, and then eventually Sundance. And I was just like, what? I get to cover Sundance. The first time I did it was remotely, and that was also the year that Coda came out. And so it was really cool watching Coda premiere at Sundance, and then see it do its release into the award season, into Oscars, and then winning Best Picture. Like, that was a really cool moment. And I was there for that. And so really through film festivals, I've kind of had this awakening of this is a real thing. This is something that I can start taking seriously, and be more involved with. And since then, I've brought writers onto the website, and they're awesome. They put out great content as well, and it's really cool, the team that I built, and everything is just kind of fallen into place, which is not what I expected 5, 6, 7 years ago.
Was there that moment for you? Because I've had it now a few times recently, where when you're starting to do it, and there's actually not only that surrealness that we're talking about, like covering a film festival, there's also that moment where you start meeting people. I'm now starting to have that weird moment where I'm meeting my heroes as a film critic. And for me, that's a very surreal moment, where it's just oh, someone that I've respected. I'm talking to them as a professional, no longer as that relationship of a fan / auteur or anything like that. That's a very big change for me, where it's just we're not necessarily equal, but I'm still talking to them as a fan, but I'm also talking to them
as a part of my job. Like, was there that time for you?
Oh, absolutely. Like I've mentioned, I've done a number of interviews with filmmakers and things like that, and it's been really cool getting to like learn about people, not just us filmmakers, but also just like other people in the film industry and like who they are as people. So I think in a way, I've in doing these interviews, I've kind of humanized, these people that I kind of see in these like really prominent positions of filmmaking, and it's nice to feel more comfortable having those conversations and understanding that yes, they're artists and they're making art that I really appreciate, but also that they're people and that they're relatable. But there are two examples that I can think of in recent history where I got to meet my heroes. One of which was Torin Barodell, who
Mm.
is the composer of the film Searching. And I remember when I first watched Searching, that opening sequence, I about got my phone out to figure out who is this composer. How do I not know who this person is? And so ever since I saw Searching, and also realized that that composer, Torin, he also composed for the video game Alto's Adventure, which I had known before the movie. So I just earned this huge respect for this guy now that I put a name to the art. And so I followed his movies and other projects that he was doing. And then last year, I noticed that he was composing for an Apple TV series called 5 Days at Memorial. And I don't know why, but I was just really drawn to like, can I reach out and get an interview? Like, would that be a thing? And I did, and we had a great conversation. He's a super cool dude, and that's posted on my website. The other one that I can think of is Goran Stolevsky,
Yeah.
who directed the film You Won't Be Alone, that debuted at South by Southwest, or sorry, not South by Sundance last year. And that movie had such a hold on me. And like, we can talk another time about like the effect that I had with that movie, but that was one of the movies that I talked about for the rest of the year. The movie was fantastic. And so when I found out that he had another movie coming out this year called Of an Age, I hopped on the opportunity to try to get an interview with him, and I did, and had a great conversation with him as well. Looking forward to what he does and continues to do as a filmmaker. And both of those interviews are on my website.
There's that moment where we should probably get back to Scorsese. There's I'm having this Scorsese series for me has been really interesting. One, because I'm recording it out of order, which is like, so just for your context, last episode I recorded was Silence. And then the episode before that I recorded was The Departed. And so I'm like, I'm at the tail end of his career, but now I'm talking about the beginning of his career. So I there's also a part of me that for myself that I want to just give the listeners a second to just like share our relationships with Scorsese, because that's something I actually haven't really gone to do much of yet. But Thomas, just for you, what is your relationship with the guy we're kind of focusing this entire month on, with Martin Scorsese?
So I think what I'm about to say might disappoint a lot of people, but I'm not necessarily a Scorsese fan. I entirely respect him as a storyteller, as a filmmaker. He has obviously a solid sense of how to craft a film. I just think that his stories aren't things that I personally connect with. But I can respect the artistry and the ability for him to tell these stories. So even though I don't gravitate to him as a filmmaker, it is incredible when I watch a movie of his to see what he does and to see how his career has developed. And that's one of the reasons when you asked me to do this, I said, you know what, let's go back to his feature debut and let me watch that. And honestly, I have a lot of blind spots with Scorsese, just because again, I don't naturally gravitate to his stories, but I think that this is a really great opportunity for me to start at the beginning and then maybe start working my way through his filmography and see what how he progressed into the filmmaker that I know him as now.
Yeah, I had the same feeling coming into it where I was just like, I have massive respect for Scorsese. I don't know if he's necessarily my favorite director to ever have done it,
Mhm.
he's certainly a guy that when I think of, I'm just like, there's not actually that many guys that I put doing it at his level for 50 years. Like that was the thing for me with him, where it was always just kind of this level of respect. And even if I don't necessarily have the love that, Goodfellas is a movie that's going to be really interesting for me to revisit because
Mhm.
it's not one of my favorite movies of all time. Like it's like a movie I like, but it's not a movie I love. And so it's going to be interesting kind of going back and rewatching and just either kind of having some of my adjustion. Sorry, I had surgery done on my teeth. So there's certain words that are just not working for me right now. But it's that moment where I'm just going to be watching some of these films and then I was talking about it. Silence was a movie I haven't watched in a decade. And then
Mhm.
my love and respect for it grew. And so going into the series starting with Who's That Knocking at My Door, there was this kind of eagerness that I had watching this movie. And
Mhm.
that eagerness comes from a place of wanting to kind of just see where somebody started off. And
Mhm.
what I find so interesting about Who's That Knocking at My Door, which I'll jump into this plot real quick. It's
Yeah.
not really much of a plot. This is a story of guy meets girl, guy is insecure about girls' past, starring Zina Bethune and Harvey Keitel. I apologize if I mispronounced Zina's name there, but that's kind of the broad story of Who's That Knocking at My Door. And for Scorsese, it's a very interesting one because it's like 89 minutes, I think. It's a
Mhm.
very short film, especially in terms of every other Scorsese movie that is to come. And so coming into this, I didn't know what to fully expect. But it's this idea that I talked about a little earlier, where it's just so fun to kind of see a craftsman perfecting a craft. Because in this movie, it's not perfected by any means. And going into this, Thomas, what was not necessarily your expectations for Who's That Knocking at My Door, but what were you kind of wanting to get out of it for a first time viewing?
Yeah, you know what? Yeah, so this was my first time watching it, and I also didn't know what to expect. This is a director that we all have an immense amount of respect for. Where did he start? What was the beginning of this, illustrious career that he's developed? And so that was just kind of um the mindset that I went into this with. Now, I know, yeah, I mentioned covering film festivals and how there's a lot of exploration with that. Something that I've really learned to earn an appreciation for is directorial debuts,
Mm,
and these first time filmmakers and seeing where they're starting and then kind of following where their career ends up taking them. And so I kind of get a retroactive effect with this one where I know where his career has gone, and I'm entirely looking forward to Killers of the Flower Moon later on this year. Another reason why I'm really happy that you're doing this series. But yeah, I just wanted to start at the beginning and see, like, okay, where does he start with his feature debut, and then later on this year we get to see, like, what his newest masterpiece is.
mm. There was this for me when going into this movie, and you kind of hit on this idea of like seeing it, knowing where it goes. Like
Mhm.
that was the big point for me, where I'm just like, some of this is just like really clearly the beginning of it. Like you can really feel like certain style that's just going to be so prevalent throughout his filmography, and certainly themes in this movie. Catholic guilt is kind of the big word that
Mhm.
when describing Who's That Knocking at My Door comes to my mind, which then obviously becomes such a reoccurring motif within Scorsese's language itself. And I for me, when doing these series, because I've done a few of these where I just kind of go back and revisit directors' filmographies. The most recent one I did was Wes Anderson with Bottle Rocket. And
Oh,
I
fun.
had the exact same relationship with Bottle Rocket that I have for Who's That Knocking at My Door, where it's the sense of I never saw it until I actually started filming the series. So I didn't know exactly what to expect. And what I think that's so cool about both of these movies, in the case for now, for Guess Who's That Knocking at My Door? I keep wanting to mix up this title with Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. For Who's That Knocking at My Door, it is really just like kind of understanding the headset he is in a director, and specifically how he utilizes an actor. And in this case, Harvey Keitel ends up becoming kind of a staple of Scorsese's filmographies. I think we think of some of the bigger names like Leonardo DiCaprio, Robert De Niro, Joe Pesci, obviously kind of in the 80s, 90s, and then back for The Irishman. Keitel is another of these guys that's kind of just there lingering throughout his filmography. And focusing it back on Who's That Knocking at My Door, Thomas, when I was watching this movie, I was kind of just astonished because I rewatched it twice in preparation for this, or I should say I watched it once and then rewatched it again last night. It's the same issue I had with Bottle Rocket, where I just couldn't penetrate it. And that's not an actual literal joke on the penetration in the movie, but it's this. I really didn't mean that. We should just.
That's a great soundbite.
There is an actual literal disconnect that I have trying to get into this movie. And did you find it watching it for the first time? What was kind of your reaction watching this movie? Because I didn't know what to expect. And I certainly, even by the end of it, I was still kind of left like, wow, this is going to be the guy who becomes the greatest like living filmmaker, like American filmmaker. Like, this is it. Like, this is the start.
Yeah, I had that exact same sentiment. It's, if I was to watch this when it came out, what was it, 67? If I was to have watched this when if I was to have watched it when it came out, I would not have had a second thought about it. I would have been like, oh, look, someone is experimenting with how to make a movie. Cool. And then moved on. Like, this isn't a film, like you said, there are a lot of things in hindsight that we can recognize as like staple Scorsese motifs and things that he does in his filmmaking. But I honestly felt it was quite hodgepodge with like the style. You see a lot of different types of transitions. There's not a whole lot of consistency with the style. He doesn't choose a style. He kind of experiments with a bunch of different things, with like close-ups and transitions and pacing and random
even
stuff.
editing. Editing for me was like the big one, where I'm just like, this is half of a Scorsese edited film, and then this is another half of just like, you really feel the 60s in this movie. And I mean that kind of in the best way and the worst ways, where it's just like, you feel the experimental nature, kind of like going back to the idea of who Andy Warhol is. Like, you really feel that artistic revolution kind of being influenced by it, which makes sense because Scorsese is a kid from New York. So he's feeling that, Greenwich Village influence that Andy Warhol and all of them are kind of portraying at that time in the mid 60s. And because I have the exact same reaction to you, where I watch this film and it's like, this is a special film because it's Scorsese. This is another film where it's just like any other filmmaker, this never becomes a film of note because they never become of note themselves. And what's then so fascinating about this, and I kind of want to get into this now, is 1967, this film premieres at the Chicago Film Festival. No one really gets to see Who's That Knocking at My Door until really post Scorsese's kind of like hits. Like, we've had Taxi Driver, we've had Mean Streets. I think this kind of really like becomes readily available for people. I want to say post Raging Bull, I want to say is the timeline, because it's advertised. And I don't know if you saw this, Who's That Knocking at My Door is literally the tagline of it on the DVD says, Mean Streets is just around the corner. Like, they're selling it as like, this is where the start of this man. And that's how you have to understand Who's That Knocking at My Door in like the 80s when people are seeing it. But this film premieres in 1967. And the reason that it's so fascinating to me is because one film critic identifies a brilliance to this, and it's Roger Ebert. who at the Chicago Film Festival is writing about the films, and he gives Guess Who's Coming, Who's That Knocking at My Door, a 3.5 out of 4-star review. And I wanted to just read a moment from one of his reviews, which is, let me just pull it up. This is Scorsese is gifted at handling subtle moments, but he has some trouble with more obvious ones. The girl claims she was raped, and a scene, parentheses, real, imagined, illustrating her story is done with a melodramatic hand. A scene at the end of the film when the boy visits a church and cuts his lips on a nail in a crucifix is awkwardly contrived. And then there's another line. This is essentially a director's film, but the performances are as good as we could possibly hope. Harvey Keitel as the boy and Zina Bethune from the former star of the TV series The Nurses as the girl finds exactly the right tone together. And Leonard Kuras, who plays the hero's best buddy, is so good. All you can say is, yes, guys like that are exactly like that. And the reason I wanted to point out that line is just, one, because Ebert identifies Keitel, and two, Ebert identifies Scorsese, and kind of not only just identifies Scorsese, identifies what Scorsese will kind of be acclaimed for the next 5 decades to come. That's so fascinating to me.
It is fascinating, and I don't know if there's a documentary or anything about early Scorsese's life and filmmaking, but I think that would be interesting to see. When I finished this movie and I just kind of thought about it in context of when it came out, in context of where it came out in Scorsese's filmography, it made me want a movie like Spielberg's The Fabelmans, just to see the progression up to making that movie, get more insight on his thought process while making the film, and maybe his own perception of himself as a filmmaker, and then what he did after that to propel him into the incredible echelons of filmmaking that he ended up reaching. Because like we've mentioned a couple times, I don't think there's anything so special about this movie that it says, at least to me, oh yes, this is a movie that will make a director the headline of all of his future movies, right? I didn't get that much specialness out of it. There are glimpses and the things you can appreciate, but then there's also just so many things that's that's just, that could use some polishing, and so yeah, there's a lot that I was thinking about, just kind of in context with this. And I think Scorsese's Scorsese's own The Fabelmans story would be something that I'd be fascinated in watching.
I totally agree, because I had that same kind of Fabelman's energy while watching this movie, and that's kind of how I approached this movie. It was I want to understand who Scorsese is, and let's see if I can kind of piece that together through watching Who's That Knocking at My Door. I've been reading this book called, and I'll show it on camera right now, it's the Twain Filmmaker series written by Les Kaiser. It's from 1992, I think, is when this filmmaker series was being released. And so it covers, if I'm correct, it covers basically his early life all the way through. I think the last movie discussed on here is Cape Fear. So it's 1991 is the last movie. So it's post, obviously, The Goodfellas, Cape Fear in 91 being the last one. And when talking about it and talking about Scorsese with everyone, and specifically reading writings about Scorsese, and this interest that I have in the film, is it's just, and I'll kind of give you context, Thomas, because I feel like I'm keeping you in the dark here. I just interviewed the director of a documentary called Chasing Amy.
Oh yes, it's just that had its premiere recently, right?
Yeah, Tribeca, I believe.
Tribeca, yep.
And so I interviewed them yesterday. And so in preparation for that, I rewatched Chasing Amy, Kevin Smith's Chasing Amy. And then the next movie that I loaded on right after Chasing Amy is Who's That Knocking at My Door? And that's not to say that Kevin Smith or Martin Scorsese are the same level of filmmakers. Kevin Smith would 100% believe that to be blasphemy if you put his name in the same sentence. Yet there's so many parallels in these stories because these stories are essentially kind of the same idea. It's a man looking for love who finds himself insecure, and it's man finding identity. And what's so fascinating to me is that's Kevin at 27, right? Like that's his third feature film. This is Scorsese identifying those things about himself in his first feature film. Like this is a guy who is so understanding of his, and I don't want to get to like therapeutic about it, but this is a guy who's so in touch with like his emotions and his insecurities and what he is going to do. Because this is largely, it feels like, even if it's never actually said, it feels very self-autobiographical. And that notion of it, then watching this movie is really just great, because while watching it, I'm like, oh, this is a guy who understands something that like other directors have to work a few films into to get.
I think that that's a very astute observation, and like and I think that there is definitely a lot to dissect there with that character. But you know, the more fascinating part of this movie for me was how he handles Zina's character.
Yeah,
I was very concerned for a lot of this movie
there's
about
a very
exactly
clear concern of it too.
well, yes, and you know, I try to take movies for the era that they're in, right? Like you can't change, you know, culture back then. But that's what really impressed me, was that when we get to the end of this movie, I was really kind of on edge about how they were going to handle, you know, the relationship and the reveal of the rape, and you know, how Harvey's character was going to eventually address that, and then how Zina's character was going to react, you know. And I was very impressed with the level of maturity that Scorsese built into ultimately the resolution of their relationship, because I was very concerned that with Harvey's character being the protagonist, that this was going to be a movie that wants us to be in favor of him or on his side, especially considering the era that this movie was made in. But I think that scene where they're having the conversation after, you know, they want to move forward, but then he says, "I forgive you," and I'm just like, ooh, that was not the right answer. But does she know that? And she does. And I thought that was very, very mature, to recognize the that she doesn't have to be subjected to, you know, this victim blaming thing that's happening in this movie, and that she recognizes when it happens and ultimately makes the best decision for herself. And I think that was very responsibly handled, I think.
There is, for those who aren't aware what we're talking about, for Who's That Knocking at My Door, the I don't want to say device necessarily of the movie is, but kind of the big reveal of the movie, that Harvey Keitel's character is having insecurity because he's wanting to wait to basically bed her. He wants to make their first time like special, essentially. And she reveals onto him, and it's kind of the last like 30 minutes of the film, that she was raped. And we see that rape on screen. Now, not in a way that is as exploitive as other scenes in this movie are. It's actually handled with fairly good like direction, where it doesn't feel too icky to watch. But that scene is kind of then like the rest of the movie, where that's why Keitel is so what's it called? He's so insecure about it, because she's no longer a virgin. And then you start seeing the Catholic imagery of it, Christ, the Virgin Mary, all of that. And you're right, because you identified what works about this movie, which is essentially, I didn't know the premise going into this movie, and I didn't know that was the plot device that they used in the movie. And the exact second that happened, I was just like, I clenched. I was like,
Yeah.
oh no, like is this what we're starting at? And what's then interesting is Scorsese identifies that feeling
Mhm,
where Keitel by the end of the movie is not the good guy. Like
mhm,
we know he's in the wrong and she's in the right. And if that doesn't necessarily stand up to the 2023 progression we may have made since 1967, it certainly is a path to getting to that enlightenment, it feels like. Where so
mhm,
many directors even now handle that so poorly, and Scorsese is able to identify as best as he can for being 1967 and being a straight white male. Like he does that about as well as you really could have asked him at that
mhm.
time period.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think that I like I said, it was I guess a nice surprise to see how that played out, and that this isn't a movie where there is a clear protagonist and a clear antagonist. There's you're with Harvey's character the whole movie, and typically that makes him the protagonist, that makes him the person that you root for. But you have this particular situation where it's like, oh, our quote unquote protagonist is not handling that right.
Yeah.
And so there's certainly just some uh conflict in how the audience wants to feel about that, and I like that complexity that's built into these characters. I like when it's not so cut and dry, when there is some moral questioning on the part of the person that we're following, and that we're supposed to, or at least that we think that we're supposed to kind of be on the side of.
And Keitel in this movie is another really interesting like aspect of this. And apologies because I keep using the word interesting, but when looking at Keitel, like there's a real ugliness to this character and an emotion that Keitel is able to kind of hit for the rest of his career, specifically with Scorsese. And there is this, I don't want to necessarily tiptoe around it. We see Keitel in his full Keitel glory. I think it's the best way to describe it.
Mm.
And there is here's the thing about Keitel. I've seen his penis too many times in films. Like and it's always unintentional. Like I never go out to see it. It's just always ends up there on the big screen. And like this is a guy who bears it all. And I mean literally all, but also just as an actor, he is so fascinating to watch because he's willing to just portray himself as an ugly man. And
Mhm,
he almost seems to relish in that. Like Keitel is so much more interesting for me as an actor when a director is like, we are going to basically give you a role that no one else would be willing to play because no one else would want to basically be allowed to be seen in this way. And he's always game for it. And in this movie, he's game for it.
mhm. Oh yeah, absolutely. I think he embodies it so well.
Yeah.
It's not like inherently a good thing, but that's acting, like he embodies it so well. And like I'm all in on like understanding who he is and the complexities of who he is, and the ugliness of who he can be. It's very well portrayed here.
Yeah, I'm having that trouble right now where all I'm thinking is Bad Lieutenant and from like the 90s, and he's also just like drugged out of his mind. It's so hard because Keitel just continues to portray himself like this in Who's That Knocking at My Door. There's a weird softness
Mhm,
to Keitel's character at the beginning, which kind of allows then the second and third act to play out the way they do. Keitel is asked to do something that I've never actually can say that I've seen in a Scorsese film. This is very autobiographical, and the feeling of this, because there's the scene really early on in the movie where Harvey and Zina meet at like
mhm,
I think they're at the ferries.
mhm,
Uh, and Keitel is essentially just kind of asked to play Scorsese for like 20 minutes of this film, where he's just rattling off like John Wayne, John Ford, like all these directors and movies that he loves. Rio Bravo is mentioned,
Mhm.
Liberty Valance, like all of these things. And he really just becomes like that Scorsese kind of writing what he knows. It's the scene where they're not necessarily on a first date, but their first meeting. And he's
Mhm.
just bombarding her with questions about movies. And it's like, that's a really funny moment for me. And it's actually probably my favorite moment in the film, because that is Scorsese just, that is the autobiographical nature of this film, like just really instilled, because that is Scorsese being like, write what you know. And if I was talking to a pretty woman, all I would be able to do is talk movies that I love.
Right. That moment, I'm pretty sure I laughed a few times in that scene. Not that it's intentionally funny, but that it's so unintentionally intentionally funny. Like that's nerd culture for that time,
Mhm.
right? Like that's that, and I think it was so well executed, because yeah, you're right. He's just rattling off, and their interaction with each other is just, it feels kind of awkward, and she's trying to invite him into the conversation, but then he's kind of standoffish, but then when he does start talking, he overtalks. Like it's a really fun and funny sequence, and does set this interesting and maybe even inaccurate first impression of how the relationship is going to go,
Mhm.
which is so interesting. To, I guess I'm saying interesting now a lot as well, but
It's just bled
but
into the conversation.
right. I mean, it's an interesting film.
Yeah.
But character development and like where a movie starts compared to where it ends is so fascinating to me, and is something that I maybe subconsciously put a lot of weight on when I watch a movie. And so that stark difference between like when they start out and it's kind of awkward, flirty, endearing kind of opening introduction from the two, to where it ends being what it is and how contentious it is because of that one situation. And then obviously their personalities, or at least Keitel's personality coming out in full force. It's I like seeing how far removed from that moment the movie ends up getting is or at least their story ends up getting, is something that I really appreciated about how the story developed.
And what's great about this scene, and it's another scene that, and not to go too far back to like the Fablemans now, connecting it with Spielberg, but you feel Scorsese's influence. And Scorsese, by admission, is somebody who just pulls shots from other movies. Like there's a famous scene, and I believe it's The Departed, where there's a scene in The Departed where Matt Damon's in the shower, and the exact three shots in that movie are the exact three shots from Hitchcock's Psycho. And
Oh,
like, there's that moment where Scorsese is doing that throughout his career, where he's just like, I loved when that director did that and when I first saw it, and I'm like recreating that. Like, that's a fun challenge for me. And with Who's That Knocking at My Door is certainly like as experimental as it is, as much as he's doing with it, there is also an aspect of it like, okay, I also am a huge John Ford fan, and I'm a huge Western fan. And I like want to like talk about them and talk about their influence on me as a filmmaker, which I've noticed, especially starting off, that's something directors don't typically do as they begin. They kind of want to make their own name for themselves. And then as they get older, they're like, let's kind of reflect back on my upbringing. Like that was kind of the story of the Fablemans. That was the
mhm.
story of Armageddon Time last year. That was the story of Clerks 3 for bringing it back to Kevin Smith. That was the story of just so many Bardo with Inarritu. Like
Mhm.
these are all directors looking back at their past. And Scorsese rightfully identifies early on. It's like, I don't know if I can necessarily change the wheel, but what if the wheel's not broken? And what if I use those tools that those other directors do in the way that the film is edited, in the fast paced nature of the discussions, of the shots and landscapes on film, in the way that I am literally putting John Ford in your mind and these better films as influences which makes it feel meta to some degree, where you're watching it and it's like, oh yeah, this, because that is the nature of Scorsese's talking to me. Like, this is the exact same conversation Scorsese has probably had 100 times in his life.
Oh, you know, with John Wayne. Oh, that other guy was in it. What's his name? He played Christ a few years ago in some movie.
I don't think I know it. Oh, was he Swedish?
No, American. Roland.
Recent picture?
Yeah, just a few years ago.
It's a Western.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it does make me want to know more about Scorsese at that time, and again, because that is a risk to lean so heavily on your influences so early in your career, and then what he does after this film to progress his career. I'm super fascinated in that. I think I might actually get off and like go do some Google searching on Scorsese in his early career.
Yeah, and what I also just New York at this time, 1967, which is, I believe, where this film is set, which it's not even a belief. This film is set in New York as it is a Scorsese movie.
Great.
He identifies something else, which is, when feeling this movie, this is one of the few where I feel Scorsese's influence in other scenes, and it's not overpowering in the movie. And I don't mean overpowering in a negative connotation by any means, but it is like, you usually can tell when you're watching a Scorsese movie in the same way that you can usually tell when you're watching a Wes Anderson movie, in the same way that you can feel that you're watching a Paul Thomas Anderson film. Like, you feel their influences so greatly.
Mm-hmm.
And watching Who's That Knocking at My Door, it is the feeling of, because we have such a language when Scorsese portrays New York, in Taxi Driver and Mean Streets and all these movies. And while watching this, I was just like, wow, the director that I am most feeling, and that style is like, that's going to become Woody Allen in moments like that.
Mm-hmm.
That sequence where we're talking about where they're first flirting and they're at the ferry, and like there's other shots of him just like walking through New York City, and it's just like, in a decade, so that's going to be Annie Hall, that's going to be Manhattan. And it's so, to me, I was just kind of blown away, because obviously in this period, we're not only getting Scorsese, we're not only getting Spielberg, we're not only getting Woody Allen, we're not about to just get David Lynch, like all of these directors, but all of these directors are pulling from the same well to some degree. Like, obviously Spielberg's out in the West, Woody Allen and Scorsese are out on the East, but they're all watching the same movies. They're all of about the same age, and they're all coming of age at the same time. Thus, they all feel in rhythm with each other, even if their thematic values and what they hit on aren't the same. They are all certainly in communication with themselves.
Mm-hmm.
For you, was that something you picked up on or noticed or even felt? Or am I kind of reaching here?
No, I think this is a realm that I have lots of learning to do when it comes to Scorsese's films and the actors that he works with. And so there's a lot that I of research that I still want to do to learn more about this, and to draw my own conclusions with.
Yeah, and jumping into, there's a very specific moment where, I don't know if it was like this for you. There were moments of this film where I'm like, that is Scorsese through and through. Like, that is the guy that I now know as Martin Scorsese. And specifically, there's one moment in the film, and you may have a different one, or you may even disagree. It's the sex scene. This Harvey Keitel, like, kind of like, he's basically with a prostitute, or multiple. I'm kind of confused on who's exactly in this scene with him. It's set to a 1960s rock song. I think it's 1960s, but it's of that era. It's cut extremely weird, a lot of close-ups, a lot of just choppy editing, really fast-paced, very psychological in some ways, very trippy in other ways. And that is a scene where I'm just like, wow, that is a Scorsese that feels a little bit more modern to me, where I've seen some of these techniques, I've seen these needle drops, I've seen this like kind of style of filmmaking that he has come back to. And even while watching it, then to learn after it, because I learned it after watching the movie, that scene was kind of forced upon him by the studio because they wanted to
I
make
was
it a
going to say that, yeah.
sexploitation.
It's you know what, that is such a fascinating thing for you to point out, because I thought the same thing, and it's so wild that that is the scene that comes to mind when I think about you know, what is most recognizable in Scorsese's style, because it was also the most forced, not
Yeah,
forced, but
that's not
like
a scene that's his
required. Yeah,
necessarily.
it's the most obligatory scene you know, of the movie, and is really just kind of thrown in. It you could take it out and it would have no bearing on how
No, it
the
has
story
no
plays out.
bearing on the absolute story. And it's like a
But yeah,
4-minute sequence in it.
it how do I say it? Like, there, we had mentioned that this is one of Scorsese's shorter films, which was another surprise for me. When I pulled it up, I was entirely expecting like a 2.5 hour movie.
Mhm.
So it was less than 90 minutes. That was like, oh, well, that's different, you
Yeah.
know. But also kind of welcome. That's cool. But in this 90-minute movie, there are some very extended sequences that may not necessarily need to be that extensive, but are. And I think that that's maybe something that has been better developed in his career, is to have extended sequences like that scene that you were talking about is one scene. Another one that I was thinking about is the scene where they're at the party and the guy pulls out a gun and it's in slow motion.
Yeah. Mhm.
And I'm just like, what's happening in this scene for it to be this long? You know.
Mhm.
um but obviously Scorsese now he can make longer films and have longer sequences and have more purpose built into the, you know, these moments, and you know, that's just it was a natural, it seems like a natural development. But it was interesting to see that this was the start, and the scene you pointed out is definitely one of those where it's just like this extended scene that seems kind of out of place, but also actually contains a lot of Scorsese. So
Yeah, because it's the most truthful scene, I feel like, in terms of his style as we kind of know it. That's not necessarily saying it's the most truthful element of this movie for Scorsese, but in terms of like what scene feels the most Scorsese in direction, I'd probably point to that scene. And it's just like, you know, not something he like had thought of. And then he's, you know, forced to kind of do it for this sexploitation element of this movie. And then in that, it's almost like it feels really weirdly honest to me, where he's just like, okay, well, if I'm going to be asked to do this, then I just kind of want to do what I want to do with it, and I like kind of want to just try with this scene. And it's a very, this is where I talked about the Greenwich Village influence of like an Andy Warhol. This is where it really feels experimental, and it feels very of the 1960s and the sexual revolution, because this is a very explicit scene. And it's probably the most explicit scene that Scorsese has directed in terms of sex. Because Scorsese, as explicit as some of his films are, he's not a particularly sexual director, and he's not particularly, he's more interested in the what sex has as an after effect, not necessarily like portraying sex in film. So to see this in it, it's just like you feel a guy testing the waters. And what I did love about Who's That Knocking at My Door is Scorsese is kind of just throwing the kitchen sink at the movie. And it's
Yes.
just like what sticks. And like what sticks is he's able to then identify that later in his career where he's like, you know, that didn't work. I'm not really going to ever go back to this style, because there are moments like that scene beneath the where they're talking at the ferry. Rewatching The Departed a few days ago, that scene has essentially been, it's an evolution now of the scene where Vera Farmiga and Matt Damon are talking in the elevator for the first time, except that scene is now so much 100 times gruffer. He's far more aggressive of a person, and it's kind of this darkly comedic scene. But it's like, okay, that's where he goes. And then So he is, when he throws everything to the kitchen sink, he really is just identifying that works, that doesn't work. And in certain sequences, you'll never see it again, really, in Scorsese's career, because he's just like identified so early on. I don't need to do this as a director. I don't want to do it, or it's not successful when I do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting observations there.
Let's kind of, just to start wrapping up parts of this conversation, how, when you finish this film,
Mhm.
what were you left with? Like, were you left with a feeling of satisfaction watching this movie? Were you left of a, let's just kind of jump to Mean Streets feeling of watching this film?
um at the end of this movie, I don't think there was a level of satisfaction for me. I think there was a level of insight.
Mhm.
That was kind of cool to have that insight. But getting to the end of the movie, it I don't know why, but it does feel just a little too open
Mm.
for a conclusion. And I guess, I watched the movie almost as like a research opportunity, right? Just to like learn more about the beginning of Scorsese's career. But I guess, narratively speaking, it was just very open and kind of left open ended. And I guess that's not always a bad thing, but I think overall that left me not disappointed with the movie by any means, but just kind of, um what's the right word for it, just unsatisfied, I guess. But even that's a little harsh. Like, I wouldn't say that it was something that I didn't I wish I hadn't watched. I thought that it was very good. So I don't know, maybe I was just left with a big ambiguous hmm.
I was
You
left
know?
with kind of a feeling of perplexity, where I'm
Yeah,
just
yeah.
watching it and just like, I can identify what works and what he will do. I'm also just kind of astonished that it polishes up so much, and that this, because it was one of these
Mm-hmm.
cases where, you and I have been at film festivals,
Mm-hmm.
and we've certainly seen films that feel a little bit more sexploitation
Yeah.
in nature, and we're like, this is kind of who that person is, and that will be the type of film they will make, and
Mm-hmm.
like that is more of what they're interested in. And that's not to say that's what Scorsese is interested in this
Mm-hmm.
movie, but there is certainly a path where he ends up kind of just making snuff films to some degree, like,
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote. Like, that really could have been like, of probably most of the types of films like this that are coming out of the 1960s, any of these directors that did end up making movies similar to Who's That Knocking at My Door probably end up directing porn in the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Okay, cool. I was gonna say it, but
yeah,
but
that's what it
they
is. Like, they end up directing Deep Throat in like
yeah.
1970, whatever. Like, that could have so easily been, I feel like, a path for Scorsese. And that's, again, not necessarily discrediting what he accomplishes in this movie. It is just so fascinating that he's kind of the rough of he's the rough, right? Like, this is a
Mm-hmm.
guy who kind of has to start at the bottom and works his way through that. And that's what's so almost endearing to me. I had this
Mm-hmm.
endearing quality where I'm just like, and I think it's because it's the first time that I had actually ever related to Scorsese in my life on a
Mm-hmm.
human level, where I'm just like, this guy's where I am right now.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he's not what he necessarily wants to be as a director. He's not that accomplished. He's not like hitting the levels or anything. Like, he doesn't still fully identify who he is as an artist slash filmmaker slash writer. And that was cool to me, because I'm like, oh my
Mm-hmm.
God, like, Scorsese was essentially at one point, like me, a 25-year-old guy, kind of just trying to make sense of something and trying to be honest with something, and not having the tools to do it.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. I get all of that. And yeah, just like imagining, I think that that's something that I do, when I reflect on this movie, is like imagining if I had seen this in the 60s when it came out, like at the end when the credits start rolling, I imagine myself like, if I'm at the premiere and the credits start rolling and the lights go up, what am I thinking? Right. Um, and I'm thinking, okay, this is a start. This is
Mhm.
There's something There's something about it. There's qualities to it. There's something that can be polished. This is a start. And it's so cool to see where that start ended up leading Scorsese's career, right?
Especially because, and to kind of wrap up this whole conversation, as you said earlier, we now know where that career went.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the $1 million question of this. Like, when watching this movie, the only reason we watch this movie, because I'm sure every other film to the Chicago Film Festival in 1967 is probably lost to time now. But this one
absolutely
endears solely because it's Martin Scorsese.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a preservation aspect to this movie, and there is a wanting to dive into it. And it's then like, it's this kind of idea that I was talking about earlier of like all these other directors who are probably in competition that year. Who knows exactly who comes out of competition that year? The Scorseses always seem to find their way out. And that's not saying that necessarily not anyone from that 1967 Chicago Film Festival is untalented. That's not what I'm saying at all. But the really special guys always somehow seem to like make it to a very vast career. And again, there are really talented people who have never gotten that break and who have never had that like luck that Scorsese is, because ultimately it is a game of luck to some degree.
It is. And I think that, I think that's why I keep saying I would love to see more about Scorsese's early career, is because the talent is important for making a name for yourself, but also luck is a big part of it, and knowing how to navigate the film industry. There's a lot that goes into it, with like networking, who how you can get resources to do your movie making. Like it's such a complex code for talented filmmakers to crack. And I just want to know how Scorsese did it, because you're right. We would not be watching this movie if Scorsese didn't end up making a name for himself. What steps did he take, in those crucial years after this debut to get there?
And it's that luck of, he just so happens to have in that audience the greatest living film critic who's ever done it, which is Roger Ebert, which is just, that is a complete luck thing. And Ebert's not Ebert at that time. Like, I think he's certainly writing for Chicago Tribune at the time, but he is not at the movies with Roger Ebert and Siskel. Like, but that's then also just another element that I kind of loved of it, is knowing that Ebert is kind of there throughout Scorsese's career. Like this, Ebert is a guy who is championing Scorsese early on in his filmography, because he identifies that there's a talent here. And I kind of want to invest in that. Like, I wanted, to some degree, Ebert is the critic of Scorsese's life, because they're coming, quote unquote, they're coming to their power at the same time. Like, they are kind of on the same timelines as age of when their fame kind of hits it and peaks. Like, they're so understanding of that. And Ebert just so rightfully identifies, like, if I really focus in on this guy, and I focus in on this guy's career, and I keep watching him, and I keep advertising him, and I keep like kind of lifting up his voice, something special is here. And I have a feeling this will reap rewards for me. And who knows if that's necessarily the mindset that Ebert was going for, but he is certainly a champion of Scorsese's, and they have a deep personal friendship that Scorsese has talked about. So that's just another aspect of luck, where it's just the most important film critic who's ever existed is right there in your theater and identifies talent and kind of gives that claim. It's the same thing that ends up happening to Spielberg, where it's just so happens to be luck that he ends up, I believe, in the Paramount studio and is able to talk to John Ford, and John Ford tells him the most important like advice you can give a young filmmaker, which is one of my favorite scenes. Sorry to go back to the Fablemans.
I know we keep talking about Fablemans. There's something there.
But it's because it's so interesting, because after watching Chasing Amy, after watching Who's That Knocking at My Door, I put on the John Ford, David Lynch scene in The Fabelmans.
Mhm.
Just like I don't know if it was because it related all or if it all just kind of made sense in my head. But I put back on that scene where he's like, if it's on the top, it's interesting. If the horizon's at the bottom, it's interesting. If it's in the middle, it's boring as shit. And that is kind of like the advice that like inspires Spielberg for the rest of his career. And that's the same way in Scorsese, where it's just Scorsese just so happened to have luck that Ebert's there and Ebert identifies him, and that Scorsese can kind of pick Ebert's brain for the rest of his career.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. It's so interesting to see those connections and where everything ends up. So,
and with that all ending up, before I let you go, we have to talk just a few questions. I'm gonna ask you for your top five Scorsese movies. And I just want to reveal right now, I'm not sharing mine. I will be recording The Irishman. It will be the last episode that airs in September with Keith Phipps. At that point, I will reveal my top five Scorsese movies. But
interesting.
Thomas,
Yeah.
I want to hear yours.
So like I said, I still have exploration of Scorsese's filmography to do, which I think that the movies that I have seen, I liked mostly, but I do have some very glaring blind spots in my watching of Martin Scorsese movies. So I do think that my favorite is one that you mentioned a little earlier, which is Goodfellas. I actually very much like that one, especially since I watched it recently. So that's my favorite. Wolf of Wall Street is another one that I really liked a lot. Shutter Island. I even liked Hugo. Hugo was really good. And then I would to round out my top five right now, I would probably put the first 3 hours of The Irishman. I think the last 30 minutes of that the last 30 minutes of that movie was a little gratuitous, and maybe a little more than I needed for that theatrical experience. So based on that list, you recognize that I'm missing some very big titles like Taxi Driver and Mean Streets, and I will get around to those. And like I said, this is a really great opportunity for me to start at the beginning and maybe work my way through the filmography. So take that information and do what you will with it. If you want to post how angry you are at me for not having seen those yet, do that. It's engagement on social media. I'm perfectly fine with it.
Exactly. And that was kind of the fun of me deciding to do this series, was there were films for me where I'm just like, I have a complete blind spot to this, even though Scorsese is one of my favorite directors. Like, I just haven't seen Mean Streets. I haven't seen Last Temptation of Christ. Sure. I haven't seen like Hugo. Like, there were just certain big blind spots in his filmography that I'm just like, like I've seen the really big ones for the most part. I kind of need to get around to these. And this is kind of I find when you're watching all of his films kind of not necessarily in a row, but just together at the same time, that's when you really learn who a person is. And that's kind of the exciting part for me. Thomas, then I have two questions to kind of end the show. And the first one is, let's start with the past. An actor who once lived, who's no longer amongst us. As a film fan, who is an actor that you would have wished could have worked with Martin Scorsese? And it can be from any era. You don't have to keep it of being alive when Martin Scorsese is of power.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is such a big sandbox to play in. I don't even know where to start. But one of the names that comes to mind as a talent that we lost too soon, that maybe could have been an interesting pairing would be, in my head, Heath Ledger. I think that would have been Ledger was on a really incredible trajectory with his acting career, just doing really, really great work. And so it is unfortunate that we lost that talent too soon. But I think a talent like that who can do pretty much anything. It seems like he just had such a variety of roles, that I think that Scorsese might have been able to work with that and done something special with it.
Yeah, I agree. I was trying to think of my own answer because I'm also trying to challenge myself to come up with a new answer for each episode.
It's a big sandbox to play in.
It's a really big one, and I was trying to identify it, and I think this guy hasn't worked with Scorsese. So for my answer, I went with Cary Grant for my first
Oh,
draft, or whatever
right.
however you want to say it. The reason I did it was because I know I know Scorsese is such a fan of Hitchcock, and Cary Grant is so instrumental
Right.
to Hitchcock. And there
Mhm.
was just this level of, here's the really interesting thing about Scorsese's career. He jumps into filmography as filmography is getting ugly, in the sense of like
Mhm.
everything's just so much more ungentlemanlike. Everything is
Mhm.
far darker. And he's one of the reasons because of that, because he makes films like Mean Streets and Taxi Driver. He
Mhm.
he never got the chance to work with necessarily the suave big talents of Hollywood. Like he never got to work with the classical leading man of a Cary Grant. His leading man is Robert De Niro, who's a psychopath in basically every portrayal of him. So I would love to see him kind of like do like with these actors that Hitchcock was able to do so well, and it kind of be a full circle moment where, Scorsese learns film language through Hitchcock, and then thus he is taking that influence of a person that Hitchcock had with Cary Grant and then putting it into his films. There was a element of that I'd like to see. So that was, I think, kind of my answer. And he does get to occasionally do this. Like he does get to have Paul Newman in The Color of Money. Like he is able to eventually get some of those guys on. There is like this period where they were just working, but they just never got the chance because Scorsese wasn't Scorsese yet
Mhm.
to work with an
Right.
actor like Cary Grant.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And then my last question for you, any actor alive now, you can pick anybody. Scorsese obviously probably doesn't have that many more films left in him. Who's that actor that you just, actor or actress that you're just like, I'd love to see them in a Martin Scorsese film?
This is also a tough one because once again, it's a big sandbox to play in, but I also think that Scorsese has his team now.
Mm,
I think that he has the people he likes to work with, and he can branch outside of that when he wants to, but there's certainly, I think that there are the connections that he has, and I think he's found, I mean, obviously he's found a stride, and he's really good at it. But the name that came to mind when I read this question was instantly Brendan Fraser. And anyone who's listening is probably like, wait a minute, he's in Killers of the Flower Moon. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons I'm really excited to see that one, is because
mhm.
Brendan Fraser is someone who I think would be very interesting in a Scorsese film. And we get to see that this year. So yeah.
That's a really good answer because Fraser is one of my favorite actors as well. So again, and this is another challenge that I'm trying to do, think of 30 actors now. And I guess that's actually to some degree also a really easy one because there's so many actors that are
Right.
talented. That's just like I think to me, this is almost a challenge of who is an actor that I think is good, but is kind of weirdly utilized in
Mm-hmm.
the current state that they're making movies, where it's just like they have talent and they've made good films, but I just don't think a director has utilized them correctly. And Scorsese is such a master of getting the best out of an actor, like what he does with Mark Wahlberg, for instance, in The Departed, is
Mm-hmm.
probably the best use of Mark Wahlberg that has existed outside of film, outside of maybe Paul Thomas Anderson.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to identify an actor that I just kind of think needed a role like that. And also, I kind of just want to save her from the fact that she seems to be trapped in the David O. Russell camp. I Jennifer Lawrence to me is like a
Oh.
name that like works.
Oh.
She is so talented, and yet I also think Hollywood has kind of failed to cast her correctly, in the sense
Uh-huh.
that like she is, I don't think she works really in any of the David O. Russell films. I think those are just not parts necessarily written for her. And, she's certainly done stuff that I find interesting. Like Mother is certainly fascinating enough experiment.
Uh-huh.
But when watching the film that she did earlier this year, No Hard Feelings, she is a loud person. She is to a
Mm-hmm.
degree, like her best talent is to a degree be obnoxious. Like she is so willing to commit and be funny and kind of be raunchy and just kind of be nasty at times. And there is a sensibility where I just see Scorsese being able to utilize an actress like that to kind of have her power through. Because Scorsese is certainly, as much as he is a subtle director, he certainly does not mind a performance going big. Joe Pesci, Mark Wahlberg, like all these performances, Jonah Hill in Wolf of Wall Street, like he certainly is able to capture bigness in an actor. And I don't always think he does it a ton with actresses. There's certainly actresses who have been big in a Scorsese movie. Sharon Stone comes to mind in Casino, but like the idea of getting to see Jennifer Lawrence kind of be unfiltered and just work for a Scorsese, I'm just like, there is something there. And who knows if it actually works or would ever come to fruition. But I think I think she would, I think she'd love to work with a Scorsese, as basically any director would. I think she would be able to get kind of that career like recognition, and other directors would then be like, oh, that's how you use Jennifer Lawrence in a film.
Bro, you're blowing my mind. I'm changing my answer to
Yeah,
Jennifer
go for
Lawrence.
it. Oh, you're changing it to Jennifer?
It's so because you said that, and suddenly I just kind of ran through J Law's filmography, and there's good movies that she's in, and she's obviously a great talent. But I think you're right. I don't think that she's utilized as well as she could be. And I think that like the movie Causeway is probably a really great example of that. Because I remember watching Causeway and thinking, man, she is still so good. I don't care for this movie, but like she is so good and she's just so captivating. And to go from like a very a hard-hitting drama like Causeway, and then swing in a totally different direction with No Hard Feelings, and be raunchy and and comedy. She has the range, she has the talent, and yeah, I could totally see Scorsese really honing that in, and being able to utilize all of those components of her in a very compelling way. So
I'm now writing down Brian Tyree Henry as an answer
there
for a
you go.
future episode. I'm like, that's a good one too. He's going to be on that list eventually.
Yes, absolutely. If Scorsese is at TIFF, I'm gonna give him this
Yeah, give him the
episode so
pitch.
that like, yo, Scorsese, you're the greatest, but hear me out, okay?
J-Law.
Let's get J Law in on this.
And then just pitch J-Lo too. Just be like, and Jennifer Lopez,
Yes.
she was great in Hustlers. Like that's
Yeah,
that's her doing
was, that's
Goodfellas.
true.
Like put her in it.
Yes, absolutely.
J-Lo might be an answer for a future one too. Now that I'm writing that down, I'm like, okay, well, I got 3 more ideas for future episodes. Anyway, Thomas,
Yes.
thank you so much for joining me on the kickoff of this series. Before I let you go, where can the people find you?
Yeah,
Just one more
absolutely. You can find ForReel at thisisforreal.com. ForReel, of course, spelled FORREEL. We're on all the social medias, so if you just search the handle at This Is For Real, you should be able to find us there. You can also follow me personally on Twitter and Instagram, and TikTok, I guess I'm there too. But at Being TSJ is my handle.
Perfect. And anyway, guys, my name is Ben Friedman, here from the Beniverse Movie Channel. Thomas, thank you for joining me on today's episode. And we will be back tomorrow, September 2nd, to talk Scorsese's Boxcar Bertha. I'd love to announce a guest. However, we are recording this July 15th. And at this moment, I have not booked a guest. So hopefully when this episode comes out, I'm with somebody and I'm not just doing a Blu-ray review of this movie by myself. But anyway, we'll be back September 2nd, Boxcar Bertha. Thank you so much for listening. Take care and bye-bye.